All righty, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming back out this evening. We are technically finishing up the lesson that we did 2 weeks ago, but we did a pretty good stopping point in discussing Antioch's early history, the world they were born into. And so just to kind of bring you back up to speed, last week we talked about quite a bit, although again, we didn't even finish. But talked about those founding families at Antioch, some of the early Christians and Sears family, the Corseys and the Bodines. It's good to have Brother Corsey back with us this morning. I don't know if many of you noticed. Brother Corsey was back with us. He's not been here since COVID.
He was here last week.
He was here last week. Okay, good deal.
I talked to him.
Yeah, glad to see him again. He's a good man. I like him. But yeah, getting back, the Corseys and the Bodines been here a long time. We talked about Rogues Harbor and the Regulators and Russellville being a rough and tumble place. Of course, out here, all of it was. Pastimes and things like that. Industrial Revolution kind of deal going on. Early maps and the fact that our original sanctuary was at Wolf Lick Meeting House, which was out on what's now 106, used to be Morgantown Hopkinsville Road. Talked a little bit about that. And then the pay for pastors and things of that nature, average cost of things. Got into some of the education, and that's where we are tonight. So as we pick up here, we're looking at Antioch's early fashion. And I'll probably stop at some point in what I'm reading and just talk about what's on screen here. But at the turn of the century, and from the 1700s into the 1800s, when Antioch was founded, most all of the clothing would have been homemade. That was just the way that it was. They didn't have stores and things of that nature where you could really purchase much clothing at all until you get into the mid-1800s, into the later 1800s. But I'm going to read this because this doesn't mean anything to me, but some of you ladies will probably know what this means or whether this is something that you can explain to me. It's written that in those days, 6 yards of cloth was considered an extravagant amount for one dress. Now, how much is 6 yards of cloth? What does that mean to you guys?
A lot.
That's a lot. Okay.
A yard wide and 6 long, I think it would be.
A yard wide and 6 feet long?
Yes.
6 yards.
6 yards long. Oh God. Okay, yeah, that's quite a bit.
I think I like that. I may.
Okay. Well, yeah, that is an extravagant amount. See, I had no idea, so I read that and I thought, I guess that's not very much, because if they considered it an extravagant amount, but that would be an extravagant amount, I expect. Okay, so yeah, 6 yards would have been too much, but they also regularly wore bonnets. We'll talk about that. Their bonnets were made of splints. Sometimes it says that you would see a leghorn hat. If you don't know what that is, leghorn hats, some of them just have wide brims. The ladies would have these kind of very flat on top and a wide brim, but sometimes also they would kind of curve around. You think, what is it, Betty Boop or whoever has the hat that kind of curves around the head. That's the kind of thing. Sometimes you would see those. Men didn't have anywhere to really put their clothes. You just kind of keep them somewhere on a shelf or something. Women's clothes, it was said, would be hung on wooden pegs around their walls of their house. You didn't have closets. So you just have a peg sticking off the wall and you hang your clothes on that. At the turn of the century at least, there was no such thing as the ruffles and silk hats and curls and jewels that women would very soon wear. But probably at the time of Antioch being planted, 1818, especially with us being so far removed from most communities and cities, the people here were probably a couple of years behind when it came to fashion from most of the people around us. So in these early days, turn to 1700s, 1800s, men were noted as wearing, as a quote, hunting shirts, buckskin breeches, coonskin hats, and moccasins. That's what they would wear. Buckskin, literally just deerskin pants. They would make their pants from deerskin. Coonskin caps, I cannot imagine somebody seriously wearing coonskin caps. You wear them ironically now, but I can't imagine someone seriously wearing one, but that was normal. And moccasins, I think I've got an image of some moccasins here in a minute. One man, William Stewart, this is a guy that lived in Russellville. He was an early frontiersman who fancied himself quite the dresser. He was said to have, quote, hunted deer, elk, and buffalo in the early days in this area. I did not know we had buffalo around here. I didn't know we had elk. I know they've got the big elk in Elkton, but I didn't think that that was something, you know.
But they have elk in eastern Kentucky now.
Really?
Yeah. They actually brought them up from the Rockies to repopulate in the early 90s.
The way we do this world. Yeah. Well, okay, so there you go. He hunted elk, deer, and buffalo in the early days in this area, and he would often close his shop and remain in the woods for several days with his trusty rifle, Betsy. We need to go back to naming things. Old Bill, as they called him, came to be called in later life, or as he came to be called in later life, wore a buckskin suit with a deerskin vest and silver coins for buttons. It says the whole ensemble was ornamented with beads and other trinkets, and as this style became more and more rare in his later life, Old Bill was regarded by children as somewhat of a circus. So you'd see him around Russellville wearing this deerskin suit with coins for the buttons and beads all over it, and he thought he looked really good, but the children thought he looked like a circus animal. It wasn't until the 1800s, and I'll come back to this slide in a second, it wasn't until the 1800s that shoes were made for a left and a right foot. You would just have shoes. And so you would either make them yourself or they would be standard. You just kind of have a shoe that was shaped the same way for both feet. They didn't have a left foot and a right foot. 1800s, they start making them for individual feet, tailored that way. So this is an image of moccasins. This is a pair from 1765, so a bit earlier. But that gives you an idea of what they would have looked like, turn of the 17 into the 1800s. This kind of shoes that people were wearing. I talked about 2 weeks ago, rubber is not manufactured yet. We do not have that. You could get it from rubber trees, but they're not indigenous to the Americas. I'm not going to say rubber didn't exist, but it's, you know, we didn't have it. So the bottoms of our shoes were usually just the same cloth that were on the top, and that was usually just skins. So this pair of moccasins here is probably made of some kind of skins, and that's just what you'd wrap. You essentially just wrap it around your feet and tie it. That's what you had. The newer style shoes, we'll talk about this in a minute, gator style shoes. That doesn't mean they're made of alligator, it's a different thing. But this first slide I had up, I did not know what the difference was between breeches and trousers and pants. I would have thought that those were the same thing. Breeches, and I'm saying it how it's spelled. We say breeches, but it's spelled breeches. I don't know why. Breeches were what women would now call capris. They were pants that end below the knee, above the ankle. And men would wear those. You would usually wear them with high-top boots. And so your boot would meet your pants at your shin level. But around the time that this fashion revolution happened, early 1800s, people transitioned to trousers which went all the way to the ankle and were loose-fitting. Now this is purely a fashion change. The reason that they wouldn't have worn such a thing like this, floor-length or ankle-length trousers that were loose, is because when you're going through briars and mud, you don't necessarily want your pants near the ground and you don't want them loose. So you would wear tight-fitting things that were up around your shin or your knee, and your boot would be everything else. So as we actually got a little more civilized, start getting official roads that were cleared, didn't spend as much time in the woods, we're not in the mud, we're not in the briars as much, you actually see that reflected in the fashion change. Because people would wear clothing that you didn't have to worry about getting mud all over your trousers or briars cutting your loose-fitting pants. Just a fun fact, pants, I even say that, pants and trousers are different by some very weird marginal thing that I'm not going to worry to bring to your attention. Pants is short for pantaloons, in case you ever want to know that, but they didn't come about until 1840s by a guy named Levi Strauss, who created them for miners who were going to California for the gold rush. They were tougher, and so you wouldn't tear them as easily in the mines. And so pantaloons actually are distinguished on the basis of what they're made of instead of what they look like. So now you know.
Sails.
What is it?
They actually originally created from extra materials from ships that would come over and
From sails.
from
that's what-
sails.
okay,
Yeah, the
from-
sails of ships. They would cut that up and use
Okay.
it for the jeans because it lasted longer.
Well, there you go. Yeah, so lasts you a bit longer. So next time you put on your pants, just thank God for the California Gold Rush. Okay, early to mid years of the 1800s. I mentioned this morning. From 1812 to 1820, a fashion revolution took place in Logan County. The old ways of dressing turned quickly into more sophisticated ways. And again, this has got a lot to do with the fact that we're becoming more civilized. Roads and getting out of the brush and the briars and the mud. So, very quickly, you began to see silk stockings and ruffled shirts and knee breeches and silver belt buckles and other buckles and other court paraphernalia of the Virginia gentry in Russellville. In fact, in Russellville from 1812 to 1820, it was considered the Philadelphia of the area with fashionable extravagance. It was often called the Athens of Southern Kentucky. As in Athens, Greece. Can you imagine Russellville being compared to Athens, Greece in terms of fashion? It was the seat of aristocracy in the Green River Valley. It was a social circle, small, but in whose magical bounds was enjoyed every pleasure which wealth and cultivated taste could afford. Here, the happy cavalier of the Old Dominion, while leading blushing beauty through the mazy dance, could possibly forget that he was in the wild frontiers of Kentucky. So there was this weird revolution that happened in the early 1800s in Russellville, Logan County, where all of a sudden you had all these aristocrats and gentrymen who came out with their fancy pants clothes, and they started arriving now that the frontier had been cleared for them. That was kind of the idea. So as clothing comes across the mountains, Appalachians and settlers are improving travel, and you have roads, and of course as you get near the middle of the 1800s, you have trains being invented and making their way out here. Ministers start dressing much more in a sophisticated way as well. Ministers, it was written, would wear suits of wool or cotton with coats and long skirts. So think tails. The pastors would wear these long skirted coats, and they would have luster or linen vests. Most men would wear cotton pants and shirts with smooth linen chests. Most men wore hats made of cotton, derby style, having a bit of a brim around them. Some people wore straw hats. I think that would probably be more common, but they don't act that way. They say that some people wore that, most men wore the other. For shoes, again, getting to here, most would wear soft leather shoes with a gaiter style. The reason that they're called gaiter style, it wasn't actually part of the shoe. The gaiter was something you would wear on your leg. So it was kind of like shin guards that you'd see on soccer players. You would button them around your leg from knee to ankle, and it would flow around the outside of the pants, or your shoe. So it would, just like your pants do now, it would flow around the outside of the shoe. You wouldn't tuck it into the shoe. It would flow around the outside of it. Reason for that, in the occasions that you did have to go into the brush, things couldn't get into your shoes. So you're wearing these sophisticated pants that are loose fitting, but you may not want anything to crawl into your shoe or to crawl up your pant leg, so you would wear these gaiters on your legs that would button tightly around and go over your shoe. So the pastors would wear such a thing because pastors had a very interesting life, a lot of them being circuit riders. They had to be both ready to go into Russellville with the aristocrats and the fancy pantses, and then ride out here to Sharon Grove with the people who were still wearing moccasins. So they had to be flexible. And so they have these kind of gaiters to put on their legs so that if they go out, they're not going to ruin their trousers, and they're not going to have snakes or anything else crawling into their shoes as they go through the brush. So they would wear that. They'd sometimes wear high-topped boots. Rubber starts coming into the picture. They would start wearing rubber anklets. and they would have rubber on the soles of their shoes for the first time. Most all of them wore neckties. They would have cuffs on their shirts. Their wrists would be fashioned sometimes with gold or pearl buttons if they were in their Sunday best. So this was a very odd sort of fashion revolution where in one small generation, 20, 30 years, you go from people wearing what, old Bill was wearing, where he's got a buckskin suit with coins for buttons, to a guy wearing, gaiters on his legs so that he doesn't tear his trousers, and his cufflinks are made of gold and pearls. It's just a very, very fast change in the fashion here in Logan County. Women wore fabrics, sometimes satin, sometimes silk. Their shirts were to the waist. They almost always had a collar. This is a photo from Lewisburg in the early 1900s, so this is a bit later. But you still get the image, you see the collar this woman has around her neck. So even a full-length dress would still have a collar that came up to the jawline. And it would kind of frame the head that way. So women would regularly wear collars like that. Oftentimes they would wear a tie. It didn't look like a necktie like what a man wears, it was more like a bow. And so, let me see, here. So you can kind of see, where's my stick? There's my stick. Moved it for the wedding. Okay, so you can kind of see she has a bit of a tie around her neck here. You can see the straps coming off her bonnet, but this that's tied in the front is actually a bow. And so she has this bow that she would tie around her collar. So you'd sometimes see them wearing a tie around that collar on their neck. This little decoration. Sometimes they'd wear coats, other times Russian blouses. Skirts were circular. Think of those, the big ones, the bell thing that the ladies had. They'd have those. Plain fronts and a full back. Oftentimes, this surprised me, even in the early 1800s in this area, Logan County, oftentimes their skirts would be trimmed with silk and satin or velvet or lace or ribbons and braids and embroidery. And I actually thought this one was interesting. This is a late 1800s photo from here in Lewisburg. You see the, what do we call this? Lace. She's got lace. Late 1800s here in Lewisburg. And she's got lace on her dress. And I wouldn't have thought that that was a very common thing, but it was. Lace and even velvet, satin and silk became more and more common all through the 1800s in this area. Okay, we can go on. Does anybody have anything they are thinking or want to get out before you forget it? Yes, Mr. Weston.
Do you know those things with like that tail?
The jacket?
Yeah.
Yeah, the jacket with tails.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask if that was actually the thing that Abraham Lincoln wore.
So yeah, that's very much like what Abraham Lincoln would wear. Especially being the president at the time, he would have definitely worn such something like this. Of course, you see the top hat. That's probably what makes you think of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, it also made me think that was actually him.
No, that's not him. I don't think he ever used a cane. He's probably a bit taller too. His wife wouldn't have been nearly that close. She looks taller than him. But yeah, Lincoln was 6'3" or 6'4", and he did wear a big top hat and probably wore stuff like that when he was dressed up. But he wouldn't have worn something like that before he was president. He was a representative before he was president, and he lived out in the frontier. He was a land surveyor before he went into government, and a lawyer after he was a land surveyor. So he wouldn't have dressed like that when he was out doing land surveying. But yeah, by the time he's president, that's how he would dress.
Yeah, I heard he actually lives in Antioch.
Yeah, he lived here in Kentucky, Elizabethtown,
Yeah, but
Hodgensville.
Hodgenville, yeah.
Okay.
No S.
yeah, we
Hodgenville.
Yes.
Gracious. Your towns. Get some real names.
I would assume Queen Elizabeth might actually own Elizabeth.
That's almost certainly where the names come from. Y'all also have Versailles. Yeah, the fact that you don't laugh at that name is ridiculous.
Isn't it Versailles?
absurd.
isn't it?
It's pronounced Versailles.
Yeah, Versailles.
That's how you say that.
That's how
Versailles.
Louisville is supposed to be Louisville, but we
Yeah.
all call it Louisville.
Louisville, yeah.
Lowell.
Just crazy. Anyway, moving on. So, regarding headwear, older women would wear small, dark straw bonnets. Oftentimes they trimmed them with ribbon. They'd have bird wings or artsy flowers kind of embroidered on them. Young women and girls would wear hats that they call sailor style. And I'll show you an example of one of those here in a minute. They'd have low brims and things like that. For shoes, women would wear shoes. This was a cool one. If they wanted decorative shoes, what do you think they used to dye them? My guess, I would have thought berries or something like that. They used blood. They would dye their shoes with blood. Whatever blood they have available, deer blood or cow blood or whatever, they would dye their shoes with blood so that you'd have decorative red shoes, or these crimson red shoes. So yeah, they would dye them with blood, or otherwise they would just wear tan shoes because they're still mostly made of skins. Some of their slippers would sometimes be goat skin. That was considered very fancy because that was softer, goat skin slippers. Sometimes they would have laces and buttons on their clothes. Oh, here's something. You may know this, you may not. So zippers. We're just accustomed to zippers. Zippers are actually a pretty recent innovation. Zippers came about after the Great Depression because it was too expensive to make buttons. So they came up with zippers to save money on buttons. I don't know how that is more cost efficient, but zippers didn't come about until after the 1930s. So yeah, everything's buttons up to this point. I didn't show you this. I don't think there's a good image of it. This is just showing you some of the stuff. Okay. So you see these buttons here, 1, 2, 3, and then here you have them, 1, 2, 3. There's no zippers. So if a man wanted to use the restroom, he had to unbutton the entire front of his pants. And then it would fold down. You see that it comes down to the leg. And so you can see this trap door here on this one. So you would unbutton all 3 buttons and the whole thing would come down. Same thing on the back. Some of you might have seen old-fashioned pajamas. They have that sort of button-down trap door on the butt. So that just was a goofy one to me, that they had to have these goofy front doors on your pants. Anyway, okay. All buttons. Women also often wore gloves, whether they were made of silk or goat skin. They carried fans regularly. No AC, understandable. And if they had the money to, women were known to wear finger rings or a watch. That was pretty fancy if you could afford that. Women would wear rings or a watch. But there's one, you can see this woman, she has lace gloves. And so you can see the very tips of her fingers, but the rest of her hand almost blends in with the dress because she's wearing these lace gloves. So that was not abnormal in this area. Women would regularly wear gloves like that. When these sort of nicer clothes became more common in this area, it became rather embarrassing very quickly to still be wearing homemade clothes. It very, very quickly became a faux pas. So even the poorest people began making their way to get manufactured clothes, whether that meant they would buy them used sometimes, or they would borrow them or get hand-me-downs or steal them. So people just very quickly got into this fashion revolution. In 1823, men started wearing trousers instead of breeches. We saw that image there. 1830, men started wearing stiff white collars like this instead of having collars that went all the way around the neck and sort of a puffy way. Think of the Parliament in England. You think about those big rings that they have around the neck. That was kind of the way to do it before 1830. Afterwards, you start getting collars like this. Women, their sleeves in 1830 became wildly large. They just get poofy sleeves, and they went all the way down to the wrist, and so you started seeing these really poofy shirts on women. In Lewisburg specifically, in the 1820s, it is noted that they, most commonly, everybody wore black, white, or gray. Just didn't have a lot of options as far as dyeing clothing. Dresses were always long. They had high necklines and small waistlines drawn in by corsets. So yes, people here in Lewisburg were wearing corsets. That was not something aristocratic, that was normal. Long, full, starched petticoats were worn beneath dresses to make the dresses puff out a bit. Babies would wear long slips and dresses, but children would never wear shoes until they were old enough to walk. So babies just never had shoes. That was considered wasteful to put shoes on a baby before it could walk. Why does it need shoes? Short hair was never to be worn by grown girls or women. That was not a thing. That didn't come to this area until about 1920. There was never to be seen a woman with short hair. Anyone seen wearing old style clothes, that is homemade clothes, by the 1850s, this is from one of the guys that lived in Russellville. He says you were considered a social leper if you were still wearing homemade clothes in the 1850s. That was just unacceptable. And let me say this, when I'm saying homemade clothes, I don't mean you bought the fabric and then mom sewed it for you. Lots of people would have been doing that. I mean deerskin, moccasins. That's what I mean by that. If you're still wearing clothes that your dad made, you were a total social leper. You had to be wearing cloth that was manufactured at this point. So no more deerskin, no more coonskin hats. Around 1849, men start wearing trousers, again, 49, gold rush. And at that same time, in 1850, for the first time, some scandalous women began wearing what they called bloomers. That was a brand new thing that women were looked at very scandalously. Oh, she's wearing bloomers. I'm not going to talk about that. You heard me mention women wearing hats. Before we go on to that, I want to talk about this woman here. This is an early pioneer woman here in Kentucky feeding her chickens. And you see, I mean, just completely covered. From neck to foot, floor-length dress, long sleeves, to go out and feed chickens. Now, this is her work clothes. And so it's just it's a different world altogether, that this is the work clothes. A floor-length dress. And this is actually why you get that old image of women wearing, only chefs wear it now, what is that? That you cook in? Aprons. They didn't wear aprons because they were, cooking. It was because this is my dress, and it's perhaps the only nice dress I have. And so women would just wear aprons because everything they were working in would get on them, so it'd keep them from ruining their dress. So that's where aprons come in. Let me grab something out of my office real quickly. I always forget something every single week, don't I? I had these laid out 2 weeks ago, and some of you got to see them. Be aware the backs of these are not on well, so hold it by the back, not the frame. But this is just some images from... I'm writing a biography on a guy named Louis Newton, who was a pastor in Atlanta from 1920s to the 1970s. And these are images from his church that I've been given by that church. But I wanted to show these because I think it's a good illustration of something, which is that for the longest time, women in the Christian atmosphere wore hats. They all wore hats. And so you'll see in these images, I defy you to find a single woman in either one of these pictures not wearing a hat. And you're looking at pictures of 100 or 200 women, every single one of them wearing a hat. Right. And so if it was a fashion thing, you'd expect it to be most of them. Right? If something's fashionable, most people wear it, but some still don't. But this is beyond fashion. This is actually a very different thing from just a fashion choice. if every single person is doing it, that goes well beyond it just being a choice of, I like the way this looks. So the question becomes, get that one up here because I hadn't seen that one. The question then becomes, what was the impetus for all these women to wear hats? It wasn't just a fashion choice or a decision, it was something bigger than that. And it actually is a biblical principle. It comes from 1 Corinthians 11. And when you read 1 Corinthians 11, there's this passage where Paul says that women, when they're in the congregation praying, they should cover their heads. And he actually says it's a shame for a woman to pray with her head uncovered. And there's a different interpretation nowadays that's more common. Thanks, sir. Nowadays, most people teach that as if it's a cultural thing that Paul was referring in their day. When I was doing my doctorate, I was taught that passage referred to something in Corinth where the women who wore their hair down were prostitutes, but women who wore their hair up were married or something along those lines. But when Paul teaches that in 1 Corinthians 11, he drives it again to creation. He says it's a shame for a woman to pray with her head uncovered because she's the glory of the man. And he drives it specifically to the existence of man and woman. And so he doesn't say it has anything to do with prostitution or anything like that. So for virtually 1950 years, all Christian women, when they came to church, wore hats. And without exception. It wasn't until, like I mentioned, the 1960s when the feminist revolution came in that women stopped wearing hats. And it wasn't a coincidence that that's when women stopped wearing hats. So, I love these images because it is just proof positive. I mean, this is the 20s and the 30s, 100 or 200 women each photo, and every last stinking one of them has a hat on. Not an exception to be found. And it wasn't any different here at Antioch. The women, it said, wore those sailor-type hats, sailor-style hats. That's these. They're just kind of a bowl that sat on your head. And they had a little brim, small brim, nothing overly decorative, just something to literally cover your head. That's why they wore them, because they believed that 1 Corinthians 11 commanded it. And that actually gets us to here. Miss Nancy brought this photo this morning. And this is from Antioch in 1932. Of course, this is young girls, but notice again, even the young girls, these are not married girls, obviously, I hope. These girls look like they're about 11. But even the young girls, there's 12 girls in this photo, and 6 of them are wearing hats. And this is at the front porch of Antioch here, back when Antioch had 2 doors, one for men and one for women. So you'll see this girl has a hat, she 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 has a hat. The girls wore hats. And that's still here at Antioch in the 30s. And so you don't see that stop until you get to the feminist revolution. Now I want to talk about this separately. Ms. Nancy did bring this, and she said that on the back of this photo there are names written, but she doesn't want to attribute them until she knows that it's actually right. So does anybody have any idea who any of these people are? I just want to ask that. Obviously none of you were alive for this, I'm not saying that, but if you've ever seen this photo or you haven't, I don't think you're going to know, Wyatt. I don't think that you're going to recognize these folks.
I think they're pioneers.
They're pioneers? Close.
First one is your mom.
It is.
The last one is Peter Williams.
So,
First row.
this one here, Nancy?
That's your mother.
That's our mother.
Look like Loretta.
Yeah.
And then you can see the last leg, it looks just like James Williams. That's his mother.
Hey,
And
so,
Elaine's in there, and some of Michael Christian's people are in there.
there's
And
a Ruby,
Harris.
And you mentioned that this girl might be Miss Genevieve's mother.
Jennifer. She's a Southern. That's Irene and Pauline Southern.
So,
No,
Yes.
that's not what her mother Huh?
Her name is Juanita.
Yeah, Juanita, that's Irene and Juanita, so,
Yeah, so very possibly,
we hope it is.
it'd be Miss Genevieve's mother, Glenn, Gail's mother, and then this would be Calvin's mother. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
So,
And I believe that girl was having a fight over it.
Huh?
I believe that girl was having a fight over it.
Which one's
I'll be
it?
Avenel's mother.
That's Elaine? Well, I thought it was Elaine, but I wasn't sure. She's in it. And Ruzel's in it. Can you find her?
She would be dark-headed.
I think she's got a hat on.
Yeah, I was gonna say the hats don't help.
I wonder if that's her with that hat.
That would be Jimmy Christian's mother.
Uh-huh.
Or not.
Some was pretty good.
Probably had, might have, then put, permanent, you ever did get a put permanent?
Mama used to, we ordered from cattle.
Wearing perms.
You put the roller over it, you put a pad thing over it, and put this hot thing on it, you just sizzle and steam.
I don't have a curly hair.
Oh, I've had them. Oh, that was the style back there. There was no beauty shop.
Yeah, I remember a lot of times you had
Look at the difference the last years later.
permanent markers.
Touch
Sure
it
did.
around, dresses all the.
Gail used to wear a jerry curl.
What'd you say?
You used to wear a jerry curl, right? But that's very, thank you, Miss Nancy, for bringing that, and that works in just perfectly, yeah.
You got that when your mother's passed away. You look at your old picture, somebody else has got it.
All right.
I've seen the picture where Antioch had the two goals.
Yeah.
I've seen the picture where Antioch had the two
I've seen another one too. I haven't seen the
What you
whole
think about
one
that?
church.
Are they
I can't
friends?
find it.
Are they friends, or?
Friends.
No, they're here.
Yeah,
that's here. That's at
this church.
I
That
thought-
picture's at this
I
church.
thought maybe they were some friends.
No, yeah, you see those hats and you think French. You think European at least. Yeah, but no, that was very, very common everywhere that there were Christians. Women looked like that until about 60 years ago.
Yeah, I gotta get lessons next.
And I know I've heard people talking here, some of our seniors talk about when you were little girls, you remember the women wearing hats. And that's why. It's just that faded away. I know when I was a little boy, there was one woman in our church that wore hats. And I remember it because it was odd. But she was an old woman. She was like 80, and that would have been 20 years ago. So, I mean, she was from the 1920s. And so this, she grew up before that revolution.
Another thing we back used to wear was gloves.
Yeah.
I don't care how hot you wore them gloves. Why can't I think how stupid you were?
Yeah.
And more nets too.
Yes, some of them had nets over their heads and things.
Like a veil
Yeah.
came down.
Well, I'll leave that up here and move on. You guys can talk if you want to. I just want to go ahead and make sure we get through this. Early in Antioch's history, we only met once a month. And we've talked about that briefly. They wanted to meet more often. They knew that they couldn't meet any less frequently than that, but they wanted to meet at least once a month. They'd sometimes gather on Saturdays. They'd have business meeting on Saturday and then have church on Sunday. That was pretty common. But oftentimes they would also have service and then have the business meeting afterwards. Sometimes you read these minutes, it'll say, after prayer and worship, the church met for business, and that's pretty common as well. We talked about last week how they had ruling elders. That was pretty common in the early days. They weren't really what we would call congregational yet. When you read our minutes, you won't see anything about voting. There's no motion made second, everybody votes. That was not really the way that they did business back then. They had borrowed that from the way that the Puritans did it, Puritans mostly being what we would now call Presbyterians. So they borrowed that, but as time went on, they became more of what we would call congregational or Baptist. The church practiced two rites, two religious practices that we hardly see at all anymore. They still did baptism and the Lord's Supper, of course, but they had two other rites that they practiced, laying hands and foot washing. That was pretty common in the early days of Antioch. I mentioned maybe a couple of weeks ago about how that when you got baptized, they'd lay hands on you. When you joined the church, they'd lay hands on you. When you got ordained, they'd lay hands on you. We still lay hands when we ordain. When someone was sick, they would lay hands on them. I still do that, but a lot of Baptist churches don't anymore. We've done that here several times at Antioch over the course of the last 5 years, maybe 3 or 4 times. But we have done that a few times here. We lay hands for that reason. But foot washing, you'll never see. You don't see that hardly at all. And that's not to say that it should be done or that it shouldn't be done. It's just that you do not see that anymore. And when we went through the Statement of Faith in 1843, they actually put it in the Statement of Faith that Antioch had to practice foot washing. That was something we firmly believed in. So, a bit different. Like I said, usually the pastor would wash the feet of the deacons, and then the deacons would wash the feet of everybody else. And if you'll watch, I try to do this every time we take communion. The deacons serve the whole church communion, and then I serve the deacons. If you'll pay attention, we do that intentionally. That's meant to be done that way. So it's the same sort of thing with the foot washing, just different rite. Revivals. Revivals were a bit different back then. They were not like what we would think of when we think revival now. They would hold a revival for anywhere from 1 to 3 years at a time. They would be in revival for 1 to 3 years, not a few weeks or months. You think, well, the revival must have been really, really different than if it lasted 1 to 3 years. Well, not really. They would have nightly meetings 2 or 3 times a week, in addition to their Sunday meetings, for 1 to 3 years. That was the revival. They would meet at somebody's house, and if a person showed that they were having a reaction or they were seeking religion, the whole community would become aware of it because they were meeting at this person's house. And so they would treat that person as if they were under conviction. They would tell the preacher about it, and the preacher would go find that person and talk with them. The community would regularly check on that person, and at some point, the person would say that they were officially a Christian and they'd be baptized. And the church would already be aware of all of that because they'd been in revival this whole time. At some point, revivals in the manner of what we think of came into play. And this is more of, we're going to pop up a tent somewhere and bring in preachers and have meetings for a week or two. That doesn't start until after the 1830s. That's the earliest that I can find anything like that happening. And in fact, the preachers in the 1830s who would have been old men were really, really against those kinds of revivals. They thought that was a very bad idea. And the reason being, they thought that it was a flash in the pan. Because they're used to, you spend 1 to 3 years trying to disciple this person to bring them to faith. That's the norm. So when you have a 1-week revival and you have all these people get saved, they think that cannot be real. You're faking something. So even 200 years ago, they're already looking at that kind of thing going, I don't know about that. But it became much more popular. When Antioch first came together, we met at the Wolf Lake Meeting House. We are, and I'll stand on this, we are the first church of Todd County. That's period. We're the first church of Todd County. Whether Baptist or otherwise. We are the first church of Todd County. Granted, when Antioch was planted, Todd County did not exist. Okay? But in what is now called Todd County, we are the oldest church. And we're the only one from that era that's still in existence. But we don't get any credit for that because we're older than Todd County. But I will be campaigning for a plaque. Todd County's oldest church. Now, here's the deal. One of the reasons that we don't get credit for that is because this sanctuary that we're sitting in was not built until the 1850s. That said, though, the next earliest church that we still have in existence was Mount Sharon, which was 20 years younger. So we were here in the 1850s. Mount Sharon was started in the 1870s. So we were already in this location for 20 years before the next oldest church in this area. And that church no longer exists. So you have very old churches, but very, very few of them are anywhere near Antioch in terms of age, especially in Todd County. And this sanctuary is by far the oldest sanctuary in Todd County. Without any competition, there's nobody close. There was, evidently, I mentioned this morning, a church that was called Everett Church at the corner of 106 and Bumpall there, a little gravel lot. Obviously, it's not there anymore. But its building had long been abandoned. Ultimately, it was taken down. I want to mention that not because it's really important, but because there's some thought in the back of my head that wonders if that was the Wolf Lick Meeting House. I don't think so, but
I know the people trying to buy that lot, and you can't do it because it's in some kind of, church, like a Methodist.
yeah, like a limbo kind of thing.
It's in limbo. I know the people trying to buy that lot.
Okay. All right, what did the inside of our church look like before we were in this building? What was the church, what did it look like? The pulpit, we would not call it that. The pulpit was a few rough slabs of wood or stone that the minister would stand on. Not behind, he would stand on top of it, just wood and stone. It was surrounded by logs made for seats. Now, they say it's surrounded by logs made for seats. I don't know if that's a log cut in half and split long ways and put like a bench, or if that's a log cut up into pieces and sat on like a stool. I don't know which to envision in my head. And my mind wants to go long ways like a bench. That's the way my mind wants to go, but I wouldn't put it past the stool kind of thing. The sermon itself, on average, would last an hour to 2 hours, just the sermon. In fact, on March 9th, 1879, a Baptist attended a revival with a Methodist preacher. The Methodist preacher preached for an hour and 45 minutes, and the Baptist offered him a quarter to keep preaching. So he was not done. He was ready for much more. So these guys preached for a long, long time. They were not nearly as bothered by distractions as we are now. Frontier people, this is a quote, wanted a preacher who could at any moment stand on a tree stump or a block or the bed of a wagon and without a single note or manuscript, quote, expound, and apply the Word of God at that moment. They just wanted the preacher to be ready to preach at any single moment, ever. There's a story here, and I'm going to go to the next slide for this. I think I've got it, yeah. A sermon was in progress at a church in a clearing when the dogs that had followed their masters there jumped a bear in the nearby woods. Okay? The minister stopped his sermon and listened intently in silence for a moment. He announced that church service would be in recess while the men went to the dogs. The women were called to pray, presumably for meat, and the preacher was then the first man to hit the ground. The men went outside, mounted their horses, and rode off. After a while, the men returned to the church. The preacher took up his sermon and began where he left off. And in his closing prayer, he thanked God for men who knew how to shoot and women who knew how to pray because, yes, they had gotten the bear. That was just a normal Sunday morning in this neck of the woods. And yet with that, people of this era were not nearly as religious as we might think them to be. The pastors had a greatly uphill battle to fight. I'll give you a bit of a hint here. The concept of Sunday schools did not begin until the 1870s. So there was no such thing as Sunday school until the 1870s. The first Sunday school at Antioch is in April of 1873. So over 50 years after the church starts, 20 years after we're in this building. No such thing as a Sunday school. The pastors in this area from 1815 to 1820 would pastor churches anywhere from Bowling Green to Dover, Tennessee. So Dover, Tennessee, if you're not familiar, is 2 hours southwest of here. Now, 2 hours southwest now on modern roads in a car. So you think of Bowling Green still an hour east by car on modern roads to 2 hours southwest by car on modern roads. We're talking days of travel in this era. Wild, wild area to cover. They had to be spread so far and wide because the early population that we see at Antioch was rather uncommon. I'll give you an example. Alex Finley, who was a pastor out of Russellville, he writes in 1806, when I got to Russellville in 1806, there were not more than 3 or 4 professors of religion in the entire town. Russellville at that time had a population of 800 or 1,000 souls, but there was no preaching, there was no house of worship, there was scarcely anything such as religion even known. The people here were not Christians. They had no concept of Christianity. In fact, one minister who was named Fightin' Jack Potter, how would you like that to be your pastor's nickname? Fightin' Jack was requested to ask the blessing at a family dinner. He was seated to eat with them and he bowed his head and asked the blessing. A 10-year-old nephew of the host family stared in wide-eyed amazement, having no idea what was going on. He's 10 years old, has never seen a person pray. He was so bewildered at the strange proceeding at the table that the next day he looked to the preacher and asked him, "Aren't you that preacher that talks to the plate?" Had no idea what was happening at dinner that day. 10 years old, has never seen a person pray. No clue. Aren't you that preacher who talks to the plate? Funerals were uncommon because there were no ministers to conduct them. You would just bury somebody. Matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln's mother, when she died, is in Illinois. She drinks milk from a cow who ate a bad plant, and she died. And they called for the pastor, but there was no pastor. There was no pastor nearby, so they just had to wait until he came through. It was about 2 months later. And by the time the pastor came back through, there were 3 other people that he did the funeral for at the same time. Weddings the same way. You would actually go and sign up to be wedded, and you would consider yourself married, and when the pastor came through, he would just do all these people who had signed up at the same time and pronounce them married. And so annulments were a lot easier back then, because if you went and signed up and then you were together for a month and you didn't like each other, you could go back, and if the pastor hadn't come around yet, you just scratch your name out and it never happened. So this very weird circumstances for the era. So anyway, what did a circuit preacher look like? It is noted he was usually equipped with a horse and a saddle and bags. He usually had one Bible and a hymn book. He would carry an umbrella sometimes, or an overcoat, and oftentimes a change of clothes. But because they were so undaunted by bad weather, their example in the face of blizzards or storms led to a folk saying for their time. Somebody would say, "There's nothing out today except crows and preachers," because they just were not stopped by anything. A pioneer circuit rider or pastor or preacher had to be tough, more than most people would imagine. He came into contact with Indians quite regularly, and he was not welcome when he was found there. In 1814, Bishop Francis Asbury held an annual conference of Methodists at Kennerly's Chapel in what was then called Henryville, now Lewisburg. Later on it was called the Lewisburg United Methodist Church. Now it's something community? Okay. So they had the Methodist annual conference there in 1814, big deal. In the 1820s, a Methodist minister in this section, this is a quote, was run off by ruffians. So in response, Peter Cartwright, who was the presiding elder over this area, sent a young man named George Richardson. He was an exhorter and a candidate for the ministry, and he sent him here to take his place. Richardson was about 19 years old and stood over 6 feet tall. Reading from his Bible in a tavern in Henrysville, he was interrupted by 3 rowdies. Putting his Bible in his pocket, he took a chair and is said to have floored all 3 of the ruffians, and it is related that he later converted all 3. So what makes matters worse is that oftentimes thieves and robbers would be some of the most intelligent people in the region. The average person was not overly intelligent or educated. Thieves and robbers oftentimes would be somewhat educated. So you end up with people like, if you've seen Tombstone, you end up with these Doc Holliday figures, who they're cowboys and they're ruffians and they're criminals, but they're really smart and they're educated, and they're some of the only people who are. So these educated and learned thieves would often be deeply religious because they could read, and some of the only reading around was religious literature. And so this is a quote. Jesse James, who, while he was a young man in Missouri, he was baptized with his brother Frank. They were both schooled in the old school religion. In later life, a minister met with Jesse and asked him about his wayward way of life. He asked why he would not change his ways. He reminded him of the example of his father, who was a minister. And Jesse replied that he would be glad to stop, but he did not intend to stop on the underside of a rope. So he's essentially saying, I'm too far now. I can't stop. If I stop now, they'll kill me. So I just have to keep doing this. I have to keep running and robbing. I can't stop. The minister reminded Jesse that as a boy he used to read his Bible. And at that, the outlaw thrust his hand into his coat pocket and pulled out a Bible. The minister reported that he handed him the Bible, and the minister opened it in astonishment, saying that he had never in his life seen a Bible so marked up, showing constant usage. Jesse's mother would testify at her son's request that when Jesse left home less than 2 weeks before he was killed, he said to her in parting, "Well, Mother, if I never see you again, we'll meet in heaven." So the thieves and the robbers and the criminals were some of the more religious people. Another member of Jesse James's gang, a guy named Cole Younger, it was said that he was a deeply religious man. A niece of his, who wrote a biography on him, said Uncle Cole really liked to read. He liked reading theological works. He was always deeply religious. Probably he would have been a minister if everything else hadn't come along. So you have these normal people who are not very religious because they don't really know how to read and write, and they don't know anything other than what they've been taught. And then you have these criminals who are really religious. And so when Mr. Richardson walks into the tavern in Lewisburg and knocks those three guys out with a chair, and then he says he converts them, it was probably not all that surprising that these guys who were really rough and tumble guys would have this religious experience, because that was not abnormal. It was the average person you had to fight really hard to get. And the second image here I've got, this one, this is from a group called the Black Robed Regiment. This is a really cool story that we'll close with here. I'm probably over my time. Yeah, we're right at 7. That's not bad. In England, they actually for a long time called the Revolutionary War the Presbyterian Rebellion. That's what they called it, because many of the leaders in the Revolutionary War were pastors. And this is what they would do. They would wear their doctoral robes, because back then pastors had to have an education. Most all of them had doctorates, and so they'd wear their doctoral robes to preach in. But as soon as they finished their sermon, they would take off their black doctoral robe and reveal that they were wearing a colonial uniform. And they would leave directly from the pulpit and go into the field and get their guns and go fight. And that was not abnormal. We talked about how many of the early founders and pastors here at Antioch were Revolutionary War veterans. Talked about John Driscoll, who was had been commissioned as a colonel. 2 guys are horse thieves. He just shot them right there. Didn't ask a single question about it. This was the kind of pastors they had. So you see this image and you think, well, that guy could knock him off a horse if I wanted to. Well, that's probably not what he looked like. He probably looked like that. He's a guy that would have been a bit intimidating. And you had to be, because it was a hard time to be a pastor, and the people that you were going to be ministering to were rough and tumble people. Very, very rough. All right, that concludes the world that Antioch was born into here in 2 weeks. Next week I won't have evening service because I'll be with the girls, Storm being in Georgia. But the following week we'll actually dive into the founding documents at Antioch, getting into what their business meetings were like. And we're going to go through this pretty quickly because a lot of it, there's not much going on. But those business meetings, some of them, there's something really important that I want to bring out, and we'll have those laid out so you can see them. I'll also have them blown up here so you can see what's going on a little easier.